Jesus said to him, "Go, your faith has made you well." Last week we talked about how there's quite a bit of humor hidden in the Bible. We tend to miss it because jokes, colloquialisms, and the like are difficult to translate. If an interpreter has to choose between a phrase's primary meaning or a verbal pun, they're going to focus on the former, especially in a religious text. Another aspect of it is that we're simply used to taking these stories extremely seriously. Our minds collapse vast spans of history into a few paragraphs and imagine this static view of our spiritual forebears where everyone is forever poised and perfect, like in an icon. Even when we know that these characters have genuinely terrible flaws, we ignore those failures and instead create these ideas of untouchable saints so distant and perfect that we could never hope to be like them. But not only can we be like them, many of us already are. It's important to remember that the Bible offers us extraordinary moments in the lives of completely normal people. Think of how much has changed since October of 2018. And then consider that everything happening in the Gospel of Mark also takes place over the course of 3 years. Abraham's story fills only 8 chapters or so in Genesis, but covers roughly 80 to 100 years of his actual lifespan. Jeremiah and Isaiah both prophesied for roughly like half a century, but everything we know about them as people fits into just a few pages. If we were to condense your most brilliant and or lousiest moments into the same amount of space, you'd probably be amazed at what you look like too. And God values your story just as much as any of theirs. But going back to the Bible's sense of humor, today's brief gospel passage is overflowing with enough verbal and physical comedy to have left Mark's initial audience in stitches. Everything Bartimaeus does is extreme, borderline slapstick. And the crowd isn't all that much better. Bartimaeus isn't just calmly sitting there calling for Jesus. He's hollering. And when the crowd starts berating him and yelling at him to shut up, he starts bellowing even louder so he can be heard over their noise. Jesus is shocked at this erupting chaos and stops like he ran into a wall. And Bartimaeus pretty much charges at him like a bull when he's called. Once all of this physical action slows, we start getting into some wordplay. After all of that bold, fearless behavior, the audience would have heard a strong double meaning of, "I need confidence," in Bartimaeus' request to receive sight. And "go" is probably the weakest and most polite possible translation of what Jesus says once Bartimaeus is healed. It's much more along the lines of, "Cool it, man," or "Okay, get lost, quietly." Although he's clearly meaning to draw out laughs, Mark's depiction offers us real-life characters, including Jesus, having the same everyday and in-the-moment responses that we might. However, despite the fun this passage offers, there's some serious stuff happening in Jesus' response too. "Go, your faith has made you well." Faith is an important word within the church, pretty much sacred. We hold the term with love, awe, and respect, even staking our eternal destinies on it. People have waged wars and sacrificed their lives for this beloved and powerful word. We generally understand faith to be a kind of spiritual intangible, something like heartfelt belief or maybe a more substantial form of hope. It dwells in the realm of other emotional and intellectual concepts. Faith involves something you feel to be true, something you deeply agree with, but might not have the hard evidence to prove. Because of its nature as an internal reality, we also think of it as something impossible to judge. A person's faith is ultimately between the individual and God. But our view of this term isn't all that different from how we've come to imagine our heroes of the faith. It, along with other terminology, has also achieved a sort of poised, statuesque status. Honored and beloved, but still somehow distant and unrelatable. And by removing its heart and its energy, by reducing faith's entire being into what is just a snapshot of a particular moment, what we think of when we hear this word doesn't often line up with what Jesus or the apostles were actually saying. In Jesus' day, faith wasn't an individualized mental construct. She was a very well-known character, one of the virtues from Pandora's box. Although the Greeks highly honored this supernatural entity, the Romans venerated her as a full-blown god, the embodiment of fidelity. She was extremely popular among the military, including the legions of soldiers occupying Israel. So even if you weren't officially a Roman citizen, when you heard someone use the word faith back then, it would have been impossible to ignore the image of honor and loyalty she invoked. Beyond that, when the Bible was initially translated into English in the mid-1300s, the word they used for this concept/being referred not to an inner type of consent, but to the lived out actions we would describe as faithfulness. The word believe carries a similar history, simply being, in fact, the verb form of the Greek noun, meaning it should carry for us the idea of be faithful to, not just intellectual agreement. Over the past 700 years, despite the extensive transformation of English as a language, we've spent a lot of energy clinging to a term while forgetting what the text itself is actually trying to say. Moving from faith to faithfulness can be a difficult change to process. I remember when they restored the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. We were all used to seeing Michelangelo's famous masterpiece as this dark, brooding, yellow-toned fresco. That's how it appeared in everyone's photos, and that's how we thought it was supposed to look. But once experts cleaned off 500 years of pollution, soot, and candle wax, everyone was shocked. The colors were bright and brilliant, making us reconsider how we'd understood entire generations of Renaissance-era art. While many of us celebrated the revelation and recovered the spirit of joy that had long lain hidden, some people loudly protested the change, demanding that the restorers undo their work and make it look the way it was supposed to be. But those voices all had it backwards. What they longed for, as familiar and comfortable, was, in truth, a dark distortion. The shining whites and glowing tones we know today were the reality that the artist himself would have remembered. So then, what happens when we understand Jesus tell us that Bartimaeus' faithfulness restored his sight? One of the first things that comes to mind involves the idea that your amount of belief or ability to trust God are what somehow bring blessing or pain to your life. In our traditional rendering, that's certainly what it looks like. But despite its popularity, that sort of name it and claim it theology is not something Jesus would have recognized. Plenty of God-honoring people have led difficult lives, both in and outside the Bible. And plenty of bad people continue to live good ones. Your amount of or ability to believe won't make God treat you better. And the doubts you might try to suppress don't prevent you from receiving God's favor. It wasn't Bartimaeus' intensive internal hope, his unwavering faith, that healed him. He didn't somehow trust just enough to make his dream of seeing again come true. He wasn't so committed to his own magical thinking that Jesus decided to make his blindness go away. Jesus said Bartimaeus was healed through his own faithfulness, the materialized, continuing action of seeking God through Christ. This restored understanding also strikes me as a bit of a warning. It's easy to say you have faith in someone or something, but it's much more revealing to see whether or not someone remains actively faithful in their behavior. Faith, as we understand it, simply involves thought, which does indeed make it impossible to judge. But faithfulness is easy to determine. We see the reality of whatever that internal thought or belief is being played out over time in the real world. But along with its challenge, faithfulness also gives me, at least, a huge sense of relief. As a human, ensuring you have saving faith, in the modern sense of the term, is an impossible task. How much faith is enough? Is it the right kind of faith? Whose faith even is it? I struggled for years over the idea that I was supposed to have perfect faith in a perfect God, while realizing that as an imperfect being, my faith couldn't help but be imperfect also. And that made it inadequate, no matter what I tried to do. However, faithfulness is something I can watch happening. It's something I prove not just to others, but to myself, as I work to follow Christ and realize God's kingdom in the lives of those around me. Like the missile test I saw yesterday morning over the Oregon mountains, faithfulness leaves a wake. My path might twist and turn. I might hit multiple areas of turbulence in my life. But I can still see the cloudy trail of my overall arc of faithfulness. Even if I don't understand, I can be faithful. Even when I doubt, I can still be faithful. Whether I'm feeling confident or discouraged, if I sin or make a mistake, rather when I sin and make mistakes. The path of faithfulness is always open for me to follow. With faithfulness, there's no need to worry or be afraid for the future. In following Jesus, you are already living the story of a saint of God. It doesn't matter how remarkable or mundane your life may be. You prove your sainthood. You realize your faithfulness. Every moment you choose to honor God. Every day you bring hope to the world around you. And every time you fall, but get back up again to follow Christ. After all, like Abraham, like the prophets, and even like our hyperactive friend Bartimaeus,